This is Jamie Drummond for Good Food Revolution. Today I'm here with a gentleman, another one of these gentlemen I haven't seen for quite some time. It's probably over 3 years now. I'm speaking with the venerable Jordan St. John, who is speaking to us from the comfort of his Toronto abode. How are you today, Jordan?
Pretty well. I like being called venerable. It puts me on the same level as Bede.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, the reason for our chat today is to do with Canadian Beer Day. Tell us a little bit about Canadian Beer Day.
Well, Canadian Beer Day is every year on October 6th. And it's nice to have one that's specifically Canadian.
Yeah.
There's National Beer Day. I believe that's in August. There's International Beer Day, which is in September. And being Canadians, we needed another beer day. So we've just gone with Canadian Beer Day. It's pretty good. When you think about the beer industry in Canada, it does represent a really significant amount of economic activity. It's in the billions of dollars. When you're looking at Ontario specifically, we're up to something like 400 to 450 breweries, if you include the contract players. So you're talking about, thousands and thousands of jobs at this point, including all the people who sell ingredients and equipment and glassware and all the people who serve beer and all the people who sell beer. It's a really significant sort of industry at this point. And I think that the figure that I'd read somewhere is that brewing might be the only growth manufacturing industry in Ontario at the moment.
Oh, that's interesting. Now, how much of that beer is consumed domestically and how much of that goes abroad?
Well, a really vast amount. I keep up with the Beer Canada statistics. Of course,
Right.
Canadian Beer Day is being put together by Beer Canada, who are a group that represents some of the larger breweries within the country. I would say that the imports really only make up about 10% of the market. And because of the global pandemic, the actual percentage of that has dropped something like 40% year over year. I think last time there were figures that came out, it was probably for July, and it was down 39% year over year for imports.
Now, do you put that down to us being proud Canadians, brand allegiance, or what do you put that down to?
Well, to some extent, yeah. I mean, one of the things that's happening is that the export market is growing somewhat. So Canadian beer is making a bit of a splash internationally as well. But when you look at domestic production, it's no longer just the large players. I mean, Molson, Labatt, Moosehead, Brick to a lesser extent in Ontario, they make up a significant portion of the market. But craft beer might be up towards 15% at the moment, probably outstripping imports now. There's a lot of variety. There's a lot of quality. I would say that it continues to improve year over year. So there's a lot to celebrate here. It's a pretty useful way to highlight the beer industry. I know I have to keep track of that on an ongoing basis, but I think that for people who aren't bogged down with the statistics of it, hosting a podcast or something like that, it is a little more difficult to keep a thumb on, It's
Now, you've been writing about beer for 11 years now or thereabouts?
something like that. I went pro in like June of 2010.
Right, okay.
Actually, in order to get into the first brewing program in Canada at Niagara College, which has really made a significant difference over the last decade or so. Of the breweries that have started up in the province of Ontario and nationally, I would say there are a huge number of Niagara College grads out there. Olds College in Alberta as well as like a sister program.
Yep.
So there's just a huge amount of developed activity on that front. I've been kind of keeping track of everything since 2010. At one point, I was writing nationally for, I believe it was Sun Media. And
the first and last syndicated beer columnist in Canada?
I believe so. There's so much material now that if you wanted to talk about things that are relevant in one province, you'd necessarily be missing out on things in another province.
I hear you. Yeah. So what are the greatest changes that you've seen throughout the evolution of beer, not only at the craft level, but at the larger producer level in the last decade or so?
Well, one of them that I find really fascinating is that beer used to be defined entirely by geographic and cultural boundary.
Mhm.
So when you come to craft beer in the early days, you're emulating things from different countries, Germany, England, Belgium to a much lesser extent. That was mostly Quebec who was emulating Belgium.
Yes, yeah, I remember. Yeah.
The language, the ability to speak French really helps with that. So, you know, you would think about making an English style bitter, or you'd think about making a German lager. When we started craft brewing in Canada, places like Upper Canada Brewing, they had the Reinheitsgebot, the German beer purity law, writ large across their marketing materials, because it was this thing you could latch on to. It was sort of a cultural demarcator.
Yes, yeah, I hear you.
And what's happened laterally is that instead of focusing on tradition, people are now focusing on ingredients. It's become really ingredient driven. In the case of a lot of the smaller breweries, they're making IPAs with all manner of different hop varieties. Currently, there's a trend towards using Ontario hops,
Yes,
or
yes.
hops grown in Canada. There's a British Columbia strain called Sasquatch, which is very popular. And at the same time that that's happening, some of the traditional hop varieties from the Pacific Northwest, Cascade, Centennial, things
Yes.
like that, your citrus and pine varieties, they're being transplanted to Ontario. People are finding out that they have different flavor profiles. You know?
I'm interested as to what you're saying there, because I can remember back in the old days of brewing in the UK, there were definitely delineations between styles, regional styles, simply to do with the availability of hops and malt, for example. So never would the Scottish import hops from England, and the English weren't too fond of taking malt from Scotland. So you'd find way back a long time ago, I mean, you correct me if I'm wrong here, but I always found the Scottish beers, traditional Scottish beers, tended to be a lot more malt focused as opposed to hop focused.
That's exactly right. And what you're seeing now is some change in that. A lot of English brewers, a lot of modern craft brewers are actually very fond of the Scottish malt Golden Promise,
Right.
which seems to have a lot more sort of residual sugar. There's some body and protein to it. It's something that really lends itself to like a New England IPA, where you've got these big, vibrant hop characteristics, and they need something to support that underneath. That's kind of what that does.
So those regional variations within Canada, they were more to do with kind of cultural touchstones than anything else.
That's exactly right. And as a result of the proliferation of the internet,
right,
and the ability to share information and emulate things, you now have really ingredient-driven brewing. I'll give you an example that I find really interesting. It's not strictly Canadian, but it's a great example of the kind of thing I mean.
Mm-hmm.
In about, I want to say January of 2018, it might have been a little earlier than that, there was a brewer in San Francisco who created a new style of beer called Brut IPA. Brut referring to the residual sugars, like it's very dry. And the way he got around to that was by adding an enzyme during the brewing process that would break down complex sugars and allow more fermentable stuff to happen.
The Germans wouldn't approve of that.
Absolutely not.
Exactly.
But in San Francisco, anything goes.
Oh, apparently, yes.
People found that fascinating. So about 4 months later, you know, there's Merit Brewing in Hamilton is doing that. And you now see Brut IPA across Canada. But probably what's happened is the trend has almost burned itself out by this point. So you do get all these interesting innovations that sometimes catch on and sometimes don't, but the speed with which they filter through the market is so much greater than it used to be.
That totally passed me by, that trend. So what do I know? We're here today to talk a little bit about Kingston and the importance of Kingston when it comes to the history of brewing, both in the past and today. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, Kingston is fascinating for a couple of reasons. The first being that there are breweries there basically from the beginning of Upper Canada. It's the first capital for Ontario. So what you end up with is beer essentially being supplied to Fort Henry. You have soldiers, they require beer in order to stay at the fort and be relatively happy about that. Usually, when you hear that British Empire thing, that 6 pints of beer a day for the soldiers, they're talking about small beer. It's really a hydrating beverage.
It's like
the
a
brewers,
1% or something like that, or thereabouts.
it might have been like 2 or 3.
Okay.
It would be hard to catch a buzz,
Right.
but it would be something that you could drink rather than the water. People claim that the water wasn't safe to drink. That's not exactly true. I mean, if you're going to have a spring, it's probably fine. And but people prefer beer just because it's a little more fun. So you've got that. You've got a couple of English brewers. I mean, brewing, as we have mentioned, up until very, very recently, was sort of defined by cultural touchstone. So when you've got people from England and people from Scotland settling in Ontario in the early part of the 19th century, they bring the styles of beer with them.
Yes, of course. Yeah.
From their country. So there are a couple of breweries that exist up until the 1830s. And then something really interesting happens. There's actually a brewery on what was called Brewery Street in Kingston, which still stands. I mean, this is one of the reasons Kingston is great for this, is that the limestone architecture is so resilient that it's just been incorporated into other buildings. I mean, 2 of the older ones have actually been incorporated into the Tet Center, but the Badges Brewery, which is on Brewery Street, still exists. That still has the stars on the side of the building that demarcate it visually as a brewery. The great thing about that one is it switches from being English to being German.
Okay.
Joseph Badges, who's the brewery there in the 1850s, his father is actually a really interesting character. He's from Frankfurt and Mainz, sort of in the Rhineland-Palatinate in Germany. And he was referred to as the Flying Man. He was basically an ultra-marathon runner who would run back and forth with messages from the courts at Frankfurt to Mainz and back. And he was faster than horses. So this is the father of this brewer. And I'm amazed to this day that the Kingston area doesn't have a beer-related running club that ends in a brewery. They've got enough breweries at this point. So you start out with it being an agricultural product, and there's a lot of space around Kingston for growing grain, things like that. In fact, the first tavern in the area would have been in Bath, Ontario in like 1783. And Kingston is unique in the sense that it basically has some of everything. It has some things that are defined by tradition. It has some things that are defined by modern craft beer styles. I have these in front of me because, bless them, they sent beer. I love it when they do that. This is from McKinnon Brothers Brewing in Bath, Ontario.
Okay.
And McKinnon Brothers were actually on the land in Bath in 1784, the year after the pub opened.
Bloody hell. Okay.
You see, that's what happens.
Yeah.
The pub opens and people show up. This beer specifically was actually brewed by Daniel McKinnon, who went to Harriet Watt.
Oh, that was around the corner from me in Edinburgh.
That's right. And this one is a spelt ale. It's made 100% spelt. It's kind of like a Hefeweizen, except that instead of going banana, it goes kind of clover honey.
Okay.
It's got a slightly dry finish to it. So this is a beer that family has collectively been working on for 400 years. It's sort of 240 years.
Where can I track that one down?
Well, at McKinnon Brothers in Bath, Ontario. I think it's brewery direct for the time being. But I mean, they're also, because they were seed farmers in the area, growing Pilsner malt, essentially just Esma barley that they're turning into Pilsner malt locally with a custom malting. And, it's named after their grandmother, kind of cool. In terms of that heritage, those styles, there's also a brewery in Kingston named Skeleton Park, which has been brewing sort of an amber ale at 6.6%. They've got an English style bitter. And Trevor LaHoo, who's the brewer there, is a little more interested in that heritage aspect of brewing within the city of Kingston. And because you've still got the military there, and they travel to England a lot. There's a lot of preference for those styles as session beers within some pubs in the city. So there's that. But, you know, in the modern context, all sorts of great things have happened. The Kingston Brewing Company, which opened in 1986, I want to say, it was the second brew pub in Ontario. And for a long time, they brewed on an extract system. I think that they still brew their cask ales that way. But they're now producing much better beer than they ever have. They have a cream ale. They've got some traditional, like 1980s holdovers. But they've also got a really good barbecue menu for their restaurant, for their patio. And they've become one of the premier sort of pub tap lists in Ontario, between sort of Toronto and Ottawa. They might be the best tap list going. So they're not only representing their beers, but other people's as well. And then on the bleeding edge of the thing, you've got, you know, Fine Balance, which is in the east end of Kingston. They have a beer that's just called Oats and Cream, which is like a New England style IPA. You've got Daft Brewing, who are in what I guess you would call Midtown, but I think they call it Williamsville, halfway up Princess Street. They're doing sour beers. Everything they do is named after a modern pop cultural reference. So there's just all this variety. And when you think that, I don't know, 7 or 8 years ago, there probably wasn't a brewery in Kingston. I think the first modern one was Stone City on Princess Street. They're now making a beer with local ingredients as well. They have a beer called Common Lager, and it's using hops from Wolf Island, just across the ferry from Kingston.
What would you say brought about this renaissance of brewing within Kingston?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of different elements that go onto it here. One of them is that you have fairly friendly zoning for breweries at City Hall. I think that's very important. But in addition to that, you've got basically a city of 150,000 people, something like that. Queens has increased the number of students attending the university over time, and that is certainly a captive market for beer.
Yeah.
But in addition to that, I think that Kingston sits in the middle of this large agricultural sort of area. Frontenac County, Lennox and Addington County. Hastings County, just west of there, has a malt company called Barn Owl that does some fantastic things. So you have this audience that has always been interested in beer.
Right. And
they're now being served in a way that they hadn't been previously. I mean, perhaps the best version of this is Spearhead Brewing. Spearhead is an odd duck. They started like 2010. They were a contract brewery. I think they turned up to the first Ontario Craft Beer Week, and the real breweries who had physical locations were not happy to see them.
So they started off with the Hawaiian, right? They were one of the early sponsors of Good Food Revolution a long time ago.
That's exactly right. They had the Hawaiian Pale Ale. They had a couple of other things, Belgian Stout at one point. And over time, what happens is, you know, contract brewing becomes a little less feasible, and they move to Kingston and open a large facility.
Right.
And as a result of that, they've become really seriously involved in the local community. And it speaks, I think, to the willingness of breweries to engage with the community that they're serving. They have a beer currently called Queen of Wheat, which is a collaborative effort with Rowena Way, who is a drag queen. And I think Josh Hader, who's the owner of the brewery, has a radio show on Wolf Island Radio.
Oh, very cool.
So they've really become part of the city. And that's what a good brewery does. Whether they're making something modern, whether they're making something traditional, building the local community and creating places for people to congregate in a way that is positive, rather than, I hate to say it, but there was a bar called the Crown, what was it, the Royal Oak? It was something like that. It was one of those taverns left over from the 1950s. George Carlin once said that a really good pub is defined by the amount of people who have thrown up on the floor. and it was that kind of place. And
Right.
it's gone now. It might have had a little negative connotation. But I think that with like a modern craft brewery with a modern audience, where people are more interested in exploring flavor and exploring novelty than they are necessarily in drinking their faces off, you do have the ability to, create a third space within your community for people to congregate. And that's really useful to the city of Kingston, which has always had pubs, but decreasingly has, churches and that kind of thing.
Thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate your time and your insight into the world of Ontario craft brewing.
My pleasure. Thanks very much for having me.
Excellent. Take care. Bye for now.